Whether you're watching your favorite NBA team at the arena, the bar, or hanging at home, grab an ice-cold Michelob Ultra and enjoy every moment of the NBA season. Stock up today and watch your team drop buckets with a bucket full of ice-cold Ultra. Michelob Ultra. Superior light beer.
Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2026 Anheuser-Busch. Michelob Ultra. Registered light beer. St. Louis, Missouri. Must be 21 plus to order alcohol. Alcohol available only in select markets.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
Hello and welcome back to the Hibs Observer's Dunbar End podcast with myself, Jack Harris, joined as ever by Hibs Observer editor Patrick McPartland. Patrick, there's been a decent bit of news for us to cover on socials and on the site so far this week. If you haven't read it, do pop over to our app or the website. You'll find it linked down somewhere below. But I mean, the two big stories, Patrick, obviously Thibault Klidje. We found out that Randers FC will not be exercising their buy option in his loan contract. He's been there since, I think, the 3rd of February. A couple of paperwork issues came his way as well, so limited the amount of playing time he had. But he's had sort of ups and downs in Denmark. And then obviously the sort of the really difficult news that Martin Boyle would not be going to the World Cup that dropped in that final cut of Tony Popovic's Socceroos squad. Patrick, where should we start? Where should we start? Should we start with Thibault Klidje?
Yeah, I think so, because in a weird way, the Martin Boyle news kind of feeds into the Thibault Klidje narrative, I suppose. I think it's one of those things where if a player's not getting a lot of time or the minutes that they want at one club, then going out on loan makes sense. And I think you could look at it one of two ways. You can look at it as, it's a chance for them to really to head out on loan and just kind of kickstart things. Maybe try and hit a vein of form that they maybe hadn't had prior to that, and just get a change of scene. Sometimes, a change is as good as a rest and all that. But I think it's with Klidje, it hasn't really happened for him, and I think there's been a lot of obviously questions about recruitment because he's the club's record signing. Hibs bring him in. He has this habit of sort of scoring every time he starts games. If you look at his underlying stats compared to the kind of leading strikers at other clubs in the league, you look at him compared to like Lawrence Shankland, if you look at him compared to Maswanise and Motherwell, really good numbers. And for whatever reason, just hasn't kind of worked out for him at Easter Road so far. When he went on loan to Randers in January, I think we, got the message from the club, from Malcolm Mackay, the sporting director, from David Gray as well, that it was a chance for Klidje to kind of go and get some minutes, to get some games, because that's what he needed most. And they'd be keeping an eye on him, and then he would come back to Hibs ready to go for pre-season. And I think when, as you mentioned there about the paperwork issues and kind of coming on in dribs and drabs, he was getting sort of little substitute appearances here and there, and he really had to wait until kind of the end of the season to really get those first starts. And of course, he scores on one of them, and it turns out to be a pretty vital goal in terms of Randers avoiding relegation to the second tier in Denmark. But I think you spoke to the Randers manager, Rasmus Bertelsen, and it did seem to be I saw a lot in what he said that David Gray's kind of said as well about Klidje, that there's sort of, obviously paraphrasing here, but there's a player in there, it hasn't quite worked out for whatever reason. So I think at Hibs, I think the physicality of the Scottish League has maybe been a bit of a surprise to him. I think he's struggled a wee bit at times with some of the sort of treatment from centre backs that he's coming up against. He does have an eye for goal. We know this. We've seen it in abundance, and I think it's just one of those things that not every signing is going to work out. It's just, for whatever reason, it's just not going to be it's not going to be what the player of the club wants it to be. And I think, Bertelsson was saying that at Randers, it hadn't gone the way that the club or the player wanted it to go. And it's kind of maybe felt a bit like that at Hibs as well. Like the price tag obviously is a lot of pressure. But
yeah,
I think, when you look at his numbers and you think you would probably want more from him. And I think it was the Livingston game at Easter Road when Hibs won 4-0. And he scored.
And he scored really early on, yeah.
He did, but he should have had, if he'd been taking his chances, he could have had 3 or 4 himself, never mind, the team scoring 3 or 4. So I think it'll be interesting to see how pre-season goes. I think we've kind of seen this movie before, maybe with Dylan Vente, with, trying to think, Jair Tavares is probably another one, maybe to a lesser extent, Harry McCurdy, that, players go out on loan, they come back, and it's just, it kind of becomes abundantly clear that for both parties, a parting of the ways is the best way to go. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case with Klidje. He could come back, he could hit the ground running in pre-season and something could just click. But I think a lot depends on sort of what Hibs are maybe able to do in the transfer market, who they can bring in attack, because I think, as we've discussed previously, they still need someone or something sort of in the final third. And I suppose just, if Klidje feels settled, if he kind of feels more used to the league, then, that could have an impact. But I think it's a big pre-season for him. And I think he, I don't think it's a case of it. He's kind of done at Hibs, but as it sometimes happens, players maybe go out on loan for the last kind of 6 months of their contract, and it's really just it's almost kind of like biding time. But for him, I think it was very much for his benefit to go out and get games. Granted, it hasn't really happened like that, but it'll be interesting to see if that's kind of given him the kind of spark to come back and think, right, it's not really worked for me at Hibs. It didn't really work out at Randers, but I've had more experience of playing different European leagues, so now I know what to expect, so I can hit the ground running and hopefully make an impression. So yeah, big preseason for him. I think it'll be interesting to see how he sort of coped with the loan in Randers, because it obviously didn't go according to plan. And I think Bertelsson's comments were he's a nice kid or something like that. He's a nice guy.
He's a very sweet boy, I think.
That was a very sweet boy, yeah. And you kind of get that impression from Hibs as well when they've been talking about him, whether it's players or the coaching staff, that lovely guy, bit quiet, maybe a bit shy, just kind of getting used to being abroad on his own, or in a different environment. So it's an interesting one to watch. It's difficult to say what way it'll go, whether he'll be looking to move on, whether he gets a chance, because Hibs are at the moment down to 4 forwards in the squad. You've got Martin Boyle, who's obviously signed a new 1-year deal. You've got Owen Elding, you've got Ante Shuto, and you've got Thibault Klidje as well. So interesting to see how David Gray manages that in the sort of, I suppose, in the immediate future, and what that'll then look like further down the line, the impact it has on recruitment, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting trying to sit and unpack Rasmus's comments. I spoke to him at the start of this week, and obviously spoke to him about 2 months before then. So a lot comes through that. What I found interesting was I read a lot into sort of the comments about Klidje and the kind of, like as you said, I mean, the loan obviously didn't work out in the way Hibs and Randers would have intended it to, but it doesn't sound by any stretch of the imagination it was a failure at all. And I think it's interesting that he gets those 2 starts, I think, against OB, and then in that sort of away defeat to Copenhagen as well. And Rasmus was telling me that it wasn't actually his intention to play Klidje in those games. I mean, he has that trusted option of playing Warren Cady in front of a sort of attacking midfielder, and then maybe bringing on Klidje to be that sort of 2-striker formation. Klidje slightly in front of, I can't remember the name of the other striker, but it was interesting that he said that that wasn't his plan, but he was almost rewarding Klidje for, I think, what he called quite important substitutions, for his work ethic, for his commitment to. One of the things he told me back in, I think, March or April when we last spoke, was that he needed to sort of see him sort of fit into the culture of the club, and how he interacted with other players in the dressing room and on the training pitch. Now, he said that the social side of the way that Klidje was involved with the club was good, and I think that was something that really came across when I spoke to him this week, was how committed he was to sort of being a team player, being involved, which Rasmus said that, that's unusual for a lone player to be that ingrained in the culture of the club. And he does get that goal. I think Rasmus said that sort of results before the game had essentially confirmed their sort of top flight status. So it was almost seemed like, oh, why don't I reward a nice guy? Because there's not really any sort of ill that's going to befall the club. If it doesn't work out, he's a nice guy. He's come along. He's worked hard.
Make it sound like a pity start.
I was thinking it's almost like the sort of participation medal. It's like thanks for being there. And I don't think that's what either party really intended. It's not Klidje's fault at all. I think the paperwork delay, those sort of Brexit related frustrations that Randers and Bertelsen had, just in terms of sort of getting him through the door. I think he said it was about a few weeks until he was available for selection. By then, he's got a striker who did all of the things he needed and wanted to recruit someone for in the door. He's had games, he's proven himself, and Klidje is sort of playing catch up with a big disadvantage. So who knows if that paperwork could have been sort of handled better, or there hadn't been that sort of logistical delay. Klidje may well have been sort of scoring goals every week and starting every week. But I think the positive from the Hibs perspective is sort of seeing how quickly he settled in there, sort of working hard in training. He does get the goal, and like you say, it will be interesting. Not everybody comes back, especially to Easter Road, and takes that loan spell and puts it onto the grass in Scotland. But I do think Rasmus did seem to think that Klidje had learned a lot from this loan spell, and it will be very interesting to see how that sort of plays out back in Scotland.
Yeah, I think so. And it's like I was saying, sometimes players go out on loan and something just clicks. So they come back to the parent club and they think, okay, right, I know, I've experienced something elsewhere. I know, I don't know, I know how lucky I am at this club. I know what I need to do. I understand better what's required from me, that sort of thing. And sometimes these things just don't work out. Sometimes signings just, for whatever reason, will not just, go according to plan. I mean, it goes back to Malcolm Mackay's 7 out of every 10 signings is kind of your ballpark figure for, you want 7 of them to be successful. And if you can get 7 of them successful, then that's a decent return. And, I think we've spoken about this before, the Hibs going to the Swiss League again is quite interesting because they obviously signed Eli Yuan from the Swiss League. They signed Klidje from the Swiss League. They signed Miguel Chaiwa from the Swiss League. So it's, when you look at what Yuan did in his time at Hibs, and when you look at what Chaiwa's done in his first season, you would look at somebody like Klidje and think, well, if he can do it in Switzerland, then surely he can do it in Scotland, like Yuan has, like Chaiwa has. And I know it's different because it's not as if these are all Swiss players who are coming over. They are from different backgrounds. You've got Klidje, obviously, from Togo, Eli Yuan with his French background, and then Miguel Chaiwa from Zambia. So there is that sort of, there are maybe, there's not like a guarantee that it's going to work out, but it's about, I think, trying to tick as many boxes as possible. So if you're Hibs and you're looking at it and you think, right, he comes from a league where, we've signed players from before who've done well, they've adapted. And Hibs have obviously seen, these teams close up as well. They played Luzerne in Europe a couple of seasons back. And, they'll kind of get a feel for, for what these teams are like and what, the players may be capable of doing. Obviously, Klidje didn't face Hibs when he was at Luzerne through injury. But it'll feel a bit like a frustrating one, I think, for Hibs, because they'll have thought quite rightly that, based on the evidence we have so far, this should hopefully work out. And then you're really kind of relying on the player to kind of fit in and to settle. And by all accounts, he seems to have settled okay, the same as he has done it, well, the same as he did in Denmark. But it's just maybe getting used to that Scottish football, because it is quite a unique beast. You hear a lot of people talking about the physicality. I mean, Chai was talked about, the kind of long ball aspect at times as well. So it might just be one of those where it's not quite clicked, and it's not going to click. It's sort of destined to, destined just to be one of those that you write off and say, well, we tried our best. both parties, club and player, and it's just not worked out. And I think it's a shame because I think we certainly have seen signs from Klidje in games when especially when he's been starting, I think, rather than coming off the bench, that there is a very talented footballer in there, and he does have that eye for goal. But the thing that gets me is just sometimes you see the coaching staff kind of shouting at him, and even like his teammates as well. And I think sometimes it's just about that kind of understanding, almost having that that kind of telepathic thing where, for example, if, I don't know, Nicky Can's got the ball on the left wing, if he knows, if he puts a ball to the back post, that there's going to be somebody there to get it. If Klidje is not getting into those spaces, then it's a move that's broken down, and that I mean, that's just an example off the top of my head. I mean, that's not a specific one that I've seen, but I just wonder whether something's not quite clicked, and that's kind of been the problem. But we'll need to wait and see how that plays out, because I think a lot of us, when he came in, we looked at his stature, we looked at his style of play, and we thought this looks, to all intents and purposes, like a long-term replacement, a successor, if you like, to Martin Boyle. And now, obviously, with Boyle staying another year, you think, does that mean that Klidje is likely to move on? Does it mean that he's going to be back kind of where he started, and that he's not going to be getting as many minutes? Is the idea that Boyle can act as a sort of almost like a kind of Dwight Gale-esque mentor to him, that they can work closely, and he can maybe try and get him used to the rough and tumble of Scottish football? Because obviously, you look at Martin Boyle, you look at Thibault Klidje, I think, Boyle just looks like
similar,
kind of always has done, in terms of physicality. But Boyle sort of uses it well. I think he's, he kind of bounces off defenders. He kind of squeezes through tight spaces and things like that. And I think it's maybe just about that, getting a bit more savvy in games, that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see. Because it could as well be, if you think about the fact that the strikers that he was playing with when he started out at Hibs, Kieran Bowie, Ellie Yuan, they've moved on. So, I don't know, maybe Klidje and Shuto is going to be like a partnership that just clicks from the off, or
Klidje
and Elding,
be fantastic,
like
because as you mentioned sort of earlier on, Klidje starts games, he scores. Ante Shuto comes on as a sub, he scores. It's just going to be goals galore with the two of them sort of replacing each other. But the Ellie Yuan one's interesting because, by all accounts, he and Klidje had quite a good relationship. I think when they were up front together, I remember watching them against Aberdeen. I think I'm right in saying both of them get a goal. I think it's Klidje and then Yuan gets the second. I may well be wrong.
No, that rings a bell. That rings a bell.
It rings a bell. Either that or Yuan gets the assist. I know Klidje scores, but the pair of them, I mean, you can see in photos like they'd sort of be laughing together. It'll be interesting in sort of that wider context of settling in. As you said, there has been a sort of change, a marked change in the forward personnel, with Owen Elding and Ante Shuto being in the building. Klidje didn't overlap, perhaps in the same way as Elding overlapped with Kieran Bowie. Sort of one comes in the door, the other leaves. Maybe they had a wee chat before Klidje then headed out, but he won't have had time to sort of get those relationships with those new players. Certainly not Shuto, who I think was in the same day Klidje was out. So it'll be interesting to see sort of how that works. But the Boyle one's an interesting one. Just one of the things I was thinking through earlier while you were talking there was, obviously this news comes out that Martin Boyle won't be part of the World Cup squad. There's a couple of other forwards who've now replaced him after all the way through the World Cup qualifiers and then the friendlies as well, and just to be sort of left without a place is really gutting for Martin. But I think from Klidje's perspective, it's maybe not too great either. I was just thinking, if Boyle had have been in the World Cup squad away, sort of representing Australia, and Klidje had been back in pre-season, and perhaps even if Boyle had a slightly later rest, and maybe missed sort of, I don't know, the part of the European round, some of the pre-season games, that almost then gives Klidje more of an opportunity. And I think it almost sort of doubles that impact of, yes, Martin Boyle has now sort of stayed at the club, and you'd expect would be sort of forefront of David Gray's attacking plans. It's then giving Klidje more of a mountain to climb, because obviously Elding's proven himself as well. I think Shuto has to some extent. There's work to be done there, but it will be difficult, I think, for Klidje to break into the sort of the attacking format of Hibs now.
Yeah, well, you could also argue that if Boyle had been at the World Cup, and depending on how deep into the competition Australia had gone, if there's then more pressure on him to sort of like, right, Martin Boyle's not playing, so we're looking at you to kind of replicate what he does, then that's even more pressure. So you've got the price tag, you've got the this is your second chance, and then you've got the we need you to fill in for Martin Boyle. So that's an awful lot for any player to kind of take on. It's a big ask, and I think that we're talking here about how Martin Boyle staying on affects Thibault Klidje. It's entirely possible that depending on what transpires, the two things won't actually really be related at all. And if you're the coaching staff, if you're the club hierarchy, you're maybe kind of looking at Boyle not making the World Cup squad, and like you wrote in your piece this week and saying that actually works out quite well for Hibs, because they've got an experienced performer, a kind of talismanic figure who won't have gone through the same kind of, I know he's been out in America and everything, but not gone through the sort of additional games and having to have an extended rest period afterwards. They'll have somebody who's kind of raring to go, who's sort of fit, and probably feels he has a bit of a point to prove as well, because when you look at it's funny because you look at how Australia, or how Tony Popovich structured his squad selection, and I think it's really, really clear what he's trying to do there. You look at Tete Yengi, somebody who's 6'6", can be a focal point from set pieces. If you look at his numbers from set pieces, they're not great. Like, for somebody who's 6'6", you think, especially when you look at Harry Souttar in that Australia squad and the number of chances he gets from set pieces. There was a time when he wasn't injured. There was a time when Australia seemed to score a set piece goal through Souttar every single game. So you can kind of understand that having somebody like Tete Yengi, having another sort of like 6'6" player in that squad, it's an option for them. And I think the whole thing with Christian Volpato and the, is he going to declare for Italy? Is he going to declare for Australia? All that kind of uncertainty, only for him to kind of turn around at the last minute and think, actually, you know what, I'll declare for Australia. That's, that kind of came out of the blue. And I think, if you've got somebody who is playing in Italy's top flight for Sassuolo, you've got somebody who, is maybe a different profile to what you've got initially, what you had initially in the squad. So, I think once you brought in the likes of Yengi and Volpato, and you sort of had that different profile, you look at the strikers they've got, you look at Mo Toure, you look at Nestor Kunda, and you think, these are the guys who are probably going to start. You look at how well Touré's been doing for Norwich. He had sort of ridiculous stats of something like, I think he scored in like 9 consecutive games or something like that. And, somebody who's in a rich vein of form, kind of up-and-coming player. And then...
Well, he was the Randers player who Thibault Klidje was signed to replace. It all comes back around.
But it's exactly where I was going with this. It's all linked.
It's all linked.
But I think when you look at the sort of age profile of that Australia squad, and it is very young, and Popovich was talking about sort of like 4 years' time, 8 years' time, he hopes that it'll be like a really good squad and able to compete. Like, not that they won't at the moment, but it's almost like a squad in transition at the moment. And I think when you looked at Yengi coming in, you looked at Volpato sort of performing a U-turn of sorts. And then you look at who else is there in the attacking ranks, and there's Matthew Leckie and there's Martin Boyle, and you think it's kind of a toss-up between the two of them. Leckie's 35, Boyle's 33. Leckie's had injury problems, Boyle's had injury problems, and I don't know. Popovich didn't give much away in his press conference, but he did kind of seem to be saying that it can't be about sort of, you can't be sentimental about it. You kind of have to pick a squad that you believe is the best for, the best for competing, the best for the job at hand. And what I find quite almost ironic, I suppose, is that there have been a lot of Australia fans, you see them on social media, who've criticised Popovich for being too loyal in the qualifiers with some of the players that he's called up, even some of the players he called up to the training camp in Florida at the start of this month. It was very much, the end of last month, actually. it was very much, why is this player on the, in the camp? Why, he shouldn't be sort of within, 40 feet of the squad, that sort of thing. And, you did kind of see that with Boyle a little bit. There was a bit of a sort of portion of the Australia support who were saying, why are we still sort of bringing him in? But it's almost like, that Leckie got the same, and now they brought Leckie in instead of Boyle. And now the sort of same supporters are saying Boyle's getting too much game time or too much involvement in the squad, and now saying, yeah, but he should have been in over Leckie. So it's an interesting one, because I think, we probably thought he was a shoo-in, despite his comments after the Motherwell game at Easter Road. I think he probably thought he was, you probably think you've got a 95% chance of making the squad, and then to have something like Volpato doing the U-turn, I mean, that's the kind of wild card that, it's so unexpected. Because Popovic actually spoke about him, I think, in the context of Shuto declaring for Australia and saying, in Shuto,
it was two of them.
Here was someone who wanted to play for Australia, had kind of, hadn't played for them at youth level, but was, very much sort of, kind of up for the fight, sort of very much kind of taking the cause on board, that sort of thing, and seemed to suggest that Volpato hadn't done that. But, you can't, I suppose, unless you're particularly fickle, if something like that, an opportunity like that presents itself on the eve of the tournament, you're not going to say, you know what, mate, you said no in the first place, so thanks, but no thanks. You're going to say, of course. So, for all we know, Boyle might have been a shoo-in for that squad until Volpato's U-turn. I think, he was always probably going to bring in somebody like Yengi just for a different profile. And I think Boyle's just been extremely unlucky with, it was probably a straight kind of shootout between himself and Leckie. And it's such a tough one, because obviously missing Qatar 2022 through injury, which happened like right before the tournament, like he was out there with the squad, and it was just a kind of precautionary thing. And they discovered that the injury is much worse than they first thought. It's it's a bitter blow, but I mean, David Gray's spoken about Boyle before and sort of said, like, even after defeats, he's the one who's sort of, picking everyone up around HTC and, just kind of being that, not quite a live wire, but just a kind of positive influence and personality around.
What was the phrase somebody had used about him in the, like, the chief vibes officer? I think he was in 2022 when he was injured, and they sort of wanted to
vibes manager. I think it was, yeah.
The vibes manager. Well, that's a sort of big part of not his game at all, but part of who Martin Boyle is as a player. He can do it on the pitch, absolutely, that's without question. But the sort of what he contributes to the dressing room as well is equally as important. I think I said that in the piece as well.
It is, yeah, and I mean that's the thing when you look at what Gray's been saying about him, sort of taking on this leadership role, becoming more kind of mature and more of a kind of trusted leader in the dressing room, rather than just this kind of madcap joker in the corner kind of thing. And I suppose that for all the jokes, for all the kind of quips and press conferences and stuff like that, Boyle was kind of fully focused on this World Cup, and I think we all kind of expected that he'd be sort of in the squad as not quite it's not quite Steve Clarke levels of kind of staying loyal to the players who you can trust, who can deliver time and time again. I mean, not to get sidetracked, but there are obviously players in that Scotland squad who are there because they've been at the previous tournaments, that they don't ever kind of call off with injury unless they absolutely have to. And Clarke knows them. He knows what they bring to the party on and off the pitch. He knows how they
and he's admitted as much. He said that that's a big part of how he selects his squad. Is like he knows who he can trust, and fair enough. He knows. I think he's always keen to sort of bring in to blood new players. I mean, it was his whole, if we would need a squad of 55, I'll go out there and find 55 players. But he does know who he trusts.
He does, and I suspect there's probably an element of that with Popovic in Australia. When you look at the players who sort of are consistently called up, who maybe don't get the minutes, but are there because he can trust them. That if he does need them, then they can deliver. But we've seen a few cases recently. If you think back to, I suppose, Jack Iredale, you think back to Triantis, you think back to Shuto, actually, in the March friendlies. I mean, all Hibs players at the time, but kind of, players who were called up and, kind of travelled halfway around the world and then didn't end up playing. And it's understandable that you might sort of think, you might feel a bit kind of hacked off with that privately, if not publicly, as a player. And I think, some players look at that and think, well, it's kind of ammunition for me that, I just need to prove that I'm worthy of involvement, I'm worthy of a start or, game time. And, others might just think, well, maybe my face doesn't fit or, it's not going to happen for me. And, I think when you look at Boyle's minutes over the recent games, like he didn't feature in the defeat by Mexico in that friendly at the start of June. He'd kind of had limited time in sort of like the most recent games. So I think he played in, I want to say 45 minutes in one of the March friendlies. I think he started the game and then was taken off at halftime. And I think kind of before that he wasn't really getting too much game time either. I think it was maybe started something like 3 out of 7 or something like that. So it almost looks as though, there has been this kind of winding down of Boyle's involvement. But I think because, and this was, before Yengi sort of arrives as this kind of last minute wildcard, before Volpato does his U-turn, it almost seemed as though Boyle would be going almost out of necessity because there wasn't an awful lot else. We looked at players, I think you looked at some of the injuries, you looked at players who were maybe out of form, and it almost looked a little bit like, not sort of by default, because that would be, doing Boyle a disservice, but it almost looked as though, he would be required because of his experience, because of, because he's been there before. I mean, what was it, 41 caps, 10 goals. And, you'd always want to have him just as an option, even just off the bench, or so you'd think. But I think if you're sort of looking at the teams you've been drawn against, you look at who you're playing, you look at the kind of profiles of players you've got, you want kind of as many different profiles as possible, I think. And I think that's probably, it's actually, I mean, it kind of mirrors the situation with Hibs, that we were looking at the forward ranks and we were saying, well, they ideally need a traditional number 9. They need a kind of 6'4" striker in the vein of Bowie or Kurevic, who can just provide something extra. Like, I don't, Shuto's not that player, even though he does have that physicality. Elding, again, physical, but, doesn't have the height, isn't the sort of the same as a, kind of hold-up striker, a target man. And it almost seems a little bit like it's been mirrored, between club and country, and, Australia all of a sudden were presented with a chance to have, this sort of battering ram of a forward in Yengi, and he's obviously shown up well in the camp and everything, the pre-tournament camp. And so I think, you can only have 26 players in your squad, and I think Boyle's just been hugely unlucky not to get taken along. And I think he posted on social media and said, kind of, here's to 2030, which I think was, a kind of typical Boyle approach. Even though he's presumably absolutely devastated, I can't imagine how he must be feeling. There's still that little kind of wry smile, a wee sort of joke, which I think is probably a bit of a coping mechanism for him, just, trying to dress it with humor. But, he gets the chance to have a break now, to kind of shut off from football for a bit, and then, kind of come back ready to hit the ground running for Hibs. So, as you said in your piece, it could end up being hugely beneficial for Hibs. And, I mean, Boyle is not the kind of player who is going to, I don't think he's the kind of player who's going to mope. He's not going to be down for too long. He's going to be, sort of desperate to kind of prove a point, to prove Popovic wrong. Not in a kind of critical sense, but just, a kind of almost proving to himself, as well as others, that he can still do it. He does have what it takes. And, if he can sort of continue the form that he had towards the end of the season, if he can replicate the sort of performances he was putting in Europe at the start of the 25-26 season, then, that's certainly to Hibs' benefit and, his club teammates.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was a sort of overarching theme of the piece, was just that it's absolutely devastating for Martin. It's a real sort of hammer blow to him, but it could be one of those decisions that, in some ways there could be a silver lining to it. But I doubt that's going to be sort of forefront of his mind. I think the disappointment will definitely be there. I think that is probably all we've got time for this afternoon. We will, of course, keep you updated with the sort of ongoing news, all the developments from Hibs over the coming weeks. So do stay tuned. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. There'll be a sort of subscribe button. There is a subscribe button. There won't be one. There is one down there. It's free. It massively supports us. We'll pop a link to our website and to our social media channels there as well. So please do follow along, and we will bring you all of the latest Hibs news. Thanks as ever for joining us, and see you very soon.